Today we are going to explore the great myths that cinema has created about medieval sieges, revealing how reality was very different from the epic battles we are used to seeing on the screens. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is something deeply fascinating in the way we imagine the Middle Ages. Imposing castles rising against stormy skies, armies marching with banners in the wind, siege towers advancing slowly, while arrows cross the air like swarms of angry bees. For decades, cinema has fueled this romanticized vision, transforming medieval sieges into spectacles of uninterrupted action, where fearless heroes face impossible odds and always emerge victorious. But what if all of this were a great illusion? And what if the true story of medieval sieges was at once darker, stranger, and infinitely more complex than any Hollywood script ever dared to portray? To understand the reality behind the myth, we first need to deconstruct the images that cinema has etched into our collective memory. And perhaps the best place to start is with those iconic structures that seem to define every medieval battle in the popular imagination. Siege towers appear in practically every movie that portrays an attack on a castle. These enormous wooden structures emerge almost magically, rolling toward the walls, while defenders prepare for dramatic confrontations. Cinema treats these towers as if they were items of medieval fast food, quick to produce, cheap, and available anywhere. The reality, however, tells a completely different story. Building a real siege tower was an undertaking that rivaled in complexity the construction of a cathedral. These were not simple wooden boxes with wheels attached to the base. A proper siege tower required master carpenters, dozens of specialized workers, and enormous quantities of quality wood. Each tower was essentially a multi-story building that needed to move to its place of work. Finding enough suitable wood created monumental logistical headaches. Armies needed fresh, strong wood from healthy forests near their target. Many castles were deliberately built in regions where large forests were scarce. Trying to build wooden towers in a treeless landscape was as practical as making snowballs in the summer. The financial cost was staggering. A single tower consumed resources equivalent to equipping hundreds of soldiers with weapons and armor. Medieval kingdoms operated on limited budgets, making siege towers the equivalent of buying sports cars when money was needed for basic groceries. The weather presented constant challenges during construction. Rain turned construction sites into muddy disasters and made the wood heavy and difficult to handle. Strong winds could blow down partially built towers or make it impossible to safely move those that were already finished. Medieval weather forecasts basically consisted of looking at the sky and hoping for the best. Fire represented the ultimate nightmare for siege tower builders. Defenders loved to fire incendiary arrows at these wooden targets because they burned spectacularly. A siege tower in flames was essentially a very expensive bonfire that no one wanted to attend. Most siege towers never reached their intended targets. Defenders had plenty of warning as these slow-moving structures approached. Watching a siege tower approach was like watching a very expensive and very flammable parade that no one had invited. Castle locations made siege towers impractical in most situations. Fortifications were built on hills, rocky terrain, and uneven surfaces specifically designed to complicate attacks. Moving a 5-story wooden building uphill while under enemy fire was exactly as difficult as it sounds. Assembly required teams of specialists who understood complex construction without modern tools or safety equipment. A grave mistake could collapse the entire project and kill multiple workers. Medieval construction standards were basically hoping no one died while building that thing. Many commanders saw siege towers as expensive bets with bad odds. Why risk enormous resources on wooden contraptions when other tactics often worked better? Smart military leaders preferred strategies with higher success rates and lower costs. Of course, when cinema cannot use massive wooden towers, it always resorts to its other favorite siege spectacle, the war machines that hurl stones against seemingly defenseless walls. Medieval films portray siege weapons as simple stone launchers. Load rock, aim at the wall, fire, repeat until victory. Real medieval siege engines were much more sophisticated and terrifying than simple stone-throwing devices. Terminological confusion begins by calling everything a catapult. Medieval armies used trebuchets powered by counterweights, mangonels that twisted ropes to generate energy, and ballistas that functioned like enormous crossbows. Grouping all this equipment under a single name was like calling every musical instrument a guitar. Technically, some were, but thus we lose the drums, pianos, and everything else that produced sound. The selection of ammunition revealed medieval creativity at its darkest peak. Common stones were considered boring options. Armies preferred psychological warfare through absolutely disgusting projectiles. Dead animals, decomposing corpses, and diseased body parts served as excellent ammunition because they spread terror, disease, and revolting odors inside enemy fortifications. Clay pots filled with incendiary substances created primitive fire weapons. These containers could start fires inside wooden structures or produce thick smoke that made defending the walls almost impossible. The goal was not always to destroy walls. Sometimes it was to make life inside the castles unbearable like a burning garbage dump. Trebuchets could launch objects weighing more than 90 kilograms at distances, exceeding 270 meters. This meant hurling something the size of a washing machine further than 3 football fields. But accuracy was a completely different challenge. Medieval siege weapon crews had approximately the same accuracy as people trying to thread needles while riding horses at a gallop. Wind, weather, mechanical problems, and human error meant that most shots missed their targets completely. Operating a trebuchet was like playing darts blindfolded while someone spun and pushed you. Weather conditions created constant operational difficulties. Rain made rope components stretch and wooden parts swell, altering the machine's performance unpredictably. Cold temperatures made materials brittle and prone to sudden failures. Medieval siege engines were basically fair-weather friends that disappeared when things got tough. Operating these weapons required teams of trained specialists. Trebuchet crews needed engineers who understood physics, carpenters capable of making field repairs, and laborers who could handle dangerous machinery without being crushed. Setup and calibration demanded considerable time before the machines could fire effectively. Enemy defensive fire often destroyed siege weapons before they achieved anything significant. Castle defenders had their own long-range weapons and did not hesitate to use them aggressively. Ammunition logistics presented serious challenges for besieging forces. Random stones did not function properly. Siege engines needed correctly sized and shaped projectiles for optimal performance. But even the most impressive war machines could not create the non-stop action that movies demand from medieval warfare. And here we come to one of the greatest distortions that cinema perpetuates, the idea that sieges were spectacles of constant combat. Medieval films transform every siege into endless action sequences filled with heroic charges, dramatic combat, and constant excitement. Real medieval sieges resembled extremely boring camping expeditions where people occasionally tried to kill each other. The typical siege involved an army sitting outside the castle walls while the defenders waited inside. No continuous battles, no daily heroic speeches, no inspiring musical soundtracks. The most exciting moments probably involved debates over whose turn it was to clean the latrines. The siege of Kenilworth in 1266 lasted more than 6 months with minimal actual combat. The attackers established camps, blocked supply routes, and waited for hunger to force surrender. Both sides occasionally exchanged arrows or insults, but mostly observed each other like bored neighbors across a very hostile fence. Hunger served as the primary weapon in most siege situations. Castles held food stocks for weeks or months, but supplies eventually dwindled. Once hunger became severe, people faced simple choices: surrender or starve. Medieval sieges were basically very expensive diet programs that no one wanted to participate in. Diseases claimed more lives during sieges than enemy weapons combined. Large populations living in cramped conditions without proper sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for every imaginable illness. Medieval army camps were basically disease factories with questionable hygiene standards and terrible customer reviews. Besieging armies endured the same hardships as castle occupants during prolonged sieges. Soldiers spent months camping in adverse conditions, dealing with terrible weather, inadequate food, and identical diseases that affected everyone else. Many siege armies lost more men to disease than to enemy action, which was probably not mentioned in their recruitment brochures. Boredom became a serious military challenge during long sieges. Soldiers needed entertainment during months of inactivity, leading to gambling, excessive drinking, and problems that commanders struggled to control. Keeping an army motivated during a 6-month camping trip with hostile neighbors was harder than planning the siege itself. When actual combat occurred, it typically happened in brief, intense episodes rather than prolonged battles. These skirmishes usually lasted a few hours before everyone retreated to safer positions. Psychological warfare often proved more important than physical combat during sieges. Both sides tried to demoralize opponents through threats, mockery, and intimidating demonstrations. Internal disagreements often determined the outcomes of sieges. Castle defenders regularly argued among themselves about the timing of surrender, resistance strategies, or escape possibilities. Diplomatic negotiations concluded many sieges instead of military conquest. Peaceful solutions often benefited everyone more than continuous camping and exposure to disease. The management of supply lines mattered more than tactical brilliance in determining winners. The side that maintained consistent deliveries of food, weapons, and healthy reinforcements usually prevailed regardless of fighting skills. When the waiting game proved too slow for medieval armies, they turned to methods much more creative than simply knocking down the front door. And here, cinema fails again to capture the real ingenuity of medieval commanders. Cinema shows armies enthusiastically destroying castle walls with siege engines until convenient holes appear for heroic charges. Real medieval commanders were not obsessed with playing architectural demolition games against fortress fortifications. Destroying thick stone walls was expensive, time-consuming, and often unnecessary. Medieval builders designed castle walls specifically to resist these attacks, making them incredibly thick and reinforced with earth or stone filling. Trying to demolish proper fortress walls was like trying to erase mountains using pencil erasers. Theoretically possible, but completely impractical. Mining represented the preferred alternative to wall destruction. This involved digging tunnels under the castle foundations, then collapsing them to bring down sections of the wall or emerging inside for surprise attacks. Underground specialists were often more valuable than surface warriors because they could literally pull the rug out from under enemy feet. Successful mining required workers who understood soil composition, structural engineering, and excavation safety. Teams dug hidden passages, reinforced them with wooden supports, and worked silently to avoid detection by people walking above. Medieval miners were basically very patient moles with construction skills. The sapping process could take weeks or months of careful excavation. Miners had to work in shifts, removing earth silently and disposing of it without alerting the defenders. They reinforced the tunnel walls with wooden posts as they went deeper. When the tunnel reached the castle foundation, they filled it with combustible materials and set it on fire. The burning supports would collapse, bringing down sections of the wall above. Water proved to be more effective than most siege engines as an offensive weapon. Many armies simply redirected rivers or streams that supplied the castle's water sources. People survived weeks without food, but died in days without water. No dramatic wall destruction needed, just some clever plumbing that turned castles into very expensive deserts. Blockades were probably the most common siege tactic because they worked reliably and cost virtually nothing. Surrounding castles and preventing supply deliveries was like forcing defenders into extremely strict diets that ended with surrender. Patience was cheaper than catapults and usually more effective too. Some armies built elaborate earthworks and wooden barriers around castles to ensure complete isolation. These siege lines could stretch for miles, completely cutting off all access to the fortress. Guards patrolled constantly to prevent supplies from reaching the defenders or messages from getting out. Financial incentives deserve recognition as highly successful siege tactics rarely shown in movies. Finding someone inside who valued money more than loyalty was often easier than building expensive siege machinery. Internal betrayal concluded more sieges than all the siege engines of medieval Europe combined. Guards accepted payment, servants responded to threats, and even nobles occasionally switched sides when situations seemed hopeless. The art of bribery required careful intelligence gathering. Attackers needed to identify which castle inhabitants could be persuaded to betray their lords. Kitchen staff could poison food stocks, guards could leave gates unlocked, and servants could provide information about defensive weaknesses. A well-placed bribe often cost less than a single siege engine. Escalade attacks using ladders and ropes to scale walls quickly were another alternative to wall destruction. These surprise assaults usually happened at night or during bad weather when visibility was poor. Success depended on speed, coordination, and catching the defenders off guard. Many castles surrendered without suffering any structural damage because the defenders recognized they could not win. When facing larger forces with superior supplies and no prospect of relief, surrender seemed smart rather than cowardly. Living to fight another day was better than dying heroically but uselessly, especially when the alternative was slow starvation. Economic considerations influenced every aspect of siege strategies. The side that could afford to maintain forces for longer usually prevailed. Operating sieges resembled managing expensive businesses, where success depended more on financial management than combat effectiveness. Political factors significantly affected siege approaches. Destroying castles completely meant rebuilding them later, to control territories effectively. Capturing intact fortifications was often more valuable than creating impressive piles of expensive rubble. Smart commanders wanted to inherit functional fortresses, not costly reconstruction projects. Seasonal timing played crucial roles in siege planning. Winter brought snow, ice, and limited daylight that complicated operations. Summer offered improved weather, but increased risks of disease and concerns about water shortages. Many sieges were deliberately timed to take advantage of harvest seasons when castle food stocks were either full or depleted. Once medieval armies managed to get inside, the reality of what happened next was nothing like the bloodbaths that cinema loves to portray. And here we touch on one of the greatest myths perpetuated by the film industry. Cinema sieges always conclude with attackers breaking through and embarking on orgies of murder that last until the final credits. According to cinema, medieval armies operated like light switches, either camping politely outside or frantically murdering everyone inside. The historical reality was much more complicated and surprisingly restrained. Mass killings made terrible economic sense for medieval conquerors. Eliminating everyone in captured cities was like demolishing factories immediately after buying them. Financially stupid and strategically counterproductive. Dead populations generated no revenue, produced no goods, and made terrible conversation partners. Medieval rulers understood practical economics better than movie screenwriters suggest. Conquered populations represented valuable human resources to be managed rather than problems to be eliminated. Farmers still needed to grow crops, artisans still needed to manufacture goods, and merchants still needed to facilitate trade. Basically, the economy needed to keep running even after the change in management. Wealthy captives were worth significantly more alive than dead because they could be ransomed. Capturing affluent nobles was like discovering treasure chests. They represented substantial potential income if handled properly. Smart attackers focused on identifying valuable prisoners rather than random violence. Historical records of major sieges demonstrate that most populations typically survived conquest. Cities that changed control multiple times during medieval conflicts retained approximately 80 to 90% of their inhabitants through each transition. People were apparently too useful to waste on dramatic gestures that looked good in stories, but made no economic sense. Considerations about diseases actually prevented many potential massacres. Large numbers of unburied corpses created ideal conditions for plagues and other illnesses that killed conquerors as readily as anyone else. Medieval people understood that creating giant open-air morgues was bad for everyone's health, including their own. The practical challenges of executing large civilian populations were enormous for medieval armies. Forces were relatively small, and systematically eliminating populations required time, organization, and resources that commanders preferred to use for other purposes. It was actually easier to let people live than to organize their deaths, which probably says something about medieval efficiency standards. Conquerors required cooperative populations to maintain control over newly acquired territories. terrorizing everyone encouraged rebellion rather than preventing it. People expecting death anyway had nothing to lose by resisting, while those expecting reasonable treatment were more likely to accept new rulers peacefully. Religious teachings limited violence during many medieval sieges. Christianity instructed that killing non-combatants was sinful, and army chaplains took these moral guidelines seriously. Medieval chronicles and histories often exaggerated the violence of sieges for entertainment value. Writers discovered that tales of terrible destruction and heroic battles attracted more readers than accurate accounts of successful negotiations. Economic calculations affected every aspect of post-siege behavior. Destroyed workshops, burned fields, and scattered populations required years to rebuild and made conquered territories less profitable. Speaking of practical considerations, medieval castle builders were much more focused on keeping people inside than on helping them escape through elaborate underground networks. And here we come to another persistent cinematic myth. Every medieval movie includes heroes escaping through secret passages that lead from the depths of the castle to convenient locations in the forest. These tunnels are always perfectly maintained, mysteriously well lit, and spacious enough for armored knights to run through without hitting their heads on anything. Actual castle construction followed completely different priorities. Building underground passages was incredibly expensive and technically demanding during medieval times. Excavating through solid rock using hand tools was as pleasant as trying to eat soup with a fork. Technically possible, but extremely frustrating. Most castles were built on rocky, elevated terrain that hindered attacks, but also made digging tunnels as practical as digging through concrete with spoons. The specialized knowledge required for stable underground construction was rare and valuable. Master builders who understood tunnel engineering could charge premium prices and typically had more profitable projects than digging secret passages. These specialists were too important to waste on projects that might never serve any purpose beyond impressing future tourists. Soil conditions determined whether tunnel construction was even feasible. Sandy soil collapsed easily. Clay became waterlogged and unstable. While solid rock required specialized tools and techniques that most builders lacked completely, finding suitable ground and skilled workers was like trying to locate unicorns that could also do math and work for reasonable wages. Water tables created huge challenges for underground construction projects. Medieval drainage technology was primitive, and flooded tunnels were completely useless for escaping anything except staying dry. Many attempted tunnel projects became expensive underground pools that served no defensive purpose and likely attracted unwanted wildlife. The volume of earth produced by tunnel excavation was massive and difficult to hide. Where exactly do you hide several tons of soil and rock when trying to keep construction projects secret? Medieval castles were not known for having large gardens where excess earth could be discreetly distributed without raising questions. Most of the supposed escape tunnels visible in modern castle ruins were actually drainage systems, storage facilities, or much later additions built centuries after the original construction. Medieval tour guides are not always historically accurate. Sometimes sewers are just sewers, not secret passages to freedom. When genuine escape routes existed, they were usually small postern gates rather than elaborate networks of tunnels. These hidden doors were built into the walls at ground level and provided access to nearby forests or rivers. But enemies were not fools. They knew to look for obvious escape routes and positioned guards accordingly. The few authentic escape tunnels that existed were typically short, rudimentary, and extremely uncomfortable. Think of crawling through muddy drainage pipes in complete darkness rather than strolling through medieval subway systems. Underground construction required constant maintenance to remain functional. Tunnels needed regular repairs to prevent collapses, drainage systems to prevent flooding, and ventilation to prevent suffocation. Security concerns made escape tunnels problematic for castle defense. Passages designed to let people out could also allow enemies to get in. Many designers avoided building escape routes because they created more defensive vulnerabilities than they solved. All these practical realities lead us to one last misconception about who really emerged victorious from these prolonged conflicts. And here is perhaps the greatest myth of all. Cinema follows a predictable formula for medieval films. Identify the heroes, watch them fight against impossible odds, then celebrate when they inevitably triumph over the villains. Cinema sieges always conclude with morally superior characters winning because the audience expects justice to prevail. Real medieval sieges were determined by much more practical considerations than ethical superiority. In real medieval warfare, victory typically went to whoever could afford to maintain armies for longer. Success depended on superior logistics, greater wealth, and better patience, rather than just causes or noble intentions. Medieval warfare was an expensive undertaking where financial resources mattered more than moral character. Basically, the richest guy usually won. The management of supply lines determined the outcomes of sieges more often than battle tactics or individual heroism. The force that maintained consistent deliveries of food, weapons, and healthy reinforcements had enormous advantages over opponents struggling with shortages and equipment problems. Efficient quartermasters were more valuable than heroic warriors, although they probably received less recognition and fewer songs written about them. Diseases affected both sides equally and often decided siege outcomes regardless of military strategy. Illnesses killed heroes and villains with identical enthusiasm. Many sieges concluded when one side or both became too sick to continue fighting effectively, making medieval warfare essentially a competition to see who could avoid dysentery for the longest. Medieval peasants and common soldiers often had no understanding of why they were fighting or who qualified as the enemy. Most conflicts involved complicated political disputes between nobles that common people neither understood nor cared about. Asking medieval infantrymen to explain the ethical dimensions of their wars was like asking modern fast food workers to explain corporate merger strategies. Switching loyalties during conflicts was common and usually based on survival considerations rather than ideological convictions. Cities and castles often changed sides when it became obvious that their current allies were losing. Self-preservation outweighed loyalty when the choices involved changing teams or facing starvation. Medieval people were practical about their career changes. Many sieges concluded through diplomatic negotiations that protected both attackers and defenders. These peaceful solutions often benefited everyone more than fighting until complete victory or defeat. Medieval politics was complicated, and current enemies could become essential future business partners. So burning bridges was generally bad policy. The concept of heroes and villains in medieval conflicts was largely invented by later storytellers and historians. Real political disputes involved competing territorial claims, inheritance arguments, and economic disagreements that rarely had obvious moral dimensions. Most medieval wars were about money and power rather than good versus evil. Weather and seasonal changes influenced the outcomes of sieges more than heroic determination or villainous conspiracy. Armies launching sieges during inappropriate seasons often retreated due to snow, rain, or extreme temperatures rather than enemy resistance. Natural forces were completely impartial and could defeat any army regardless of moral standing. Fortifications and terrain advantages usually mattered more than the justice of either side's cause. Well-designed castles and strong positions could withstand sieges from much larger forces, while poorly defended locations fell quickly regardless of the virtue of their occupants. The reality of medieval siege warfare was that most conflicts concluded through compromise, exhaustion, or practical necessity, rather than the triumph of good over evil. Victory usually went to whoever made fewer mistakes and managed resources more effectively. Medieval sieges were not the epic battles of clear morality that cinema has sold us for decades. They were long, dirty, often boring undertakings where patience, money, and logistics determined winners much more often than courage or righteousness. The true heroes of these conflicts were often the accountants who managed supplies, the diplomats who negotiated surrenders, and the commanders who knew when not to fight. Real history is less glamorous, but infinitely more fascinating than any Hollywood version could ever be. And so we come to the end of our journey through real medieval sieges. If you found this historical exploration as fascinating as we did while researching it, consider this an invitation to join us in future investigations into the mysteries of the past. Every subscription to the channel is like a stone placed in the foundations of a community of history-curious people. Every like is a sign that we are on the right path, revealing the truths hidden behind the myths that modern entertainment has created. And your comments are the conversations that turn this channel into something more than videos. They are debates, discoveries, and connections between people who share the same passion for knowledge. So, if this documentary narrative sparked your curiosity, leave your mark. Subscribe, like, and share your reflections with us in the comments. After all, history is better when discovered in good company.